Welcome to $100 Plus Mileage, the podcast that gives you a peek at New Hampshire's legislative process and unpacks the facts, pros, and cons. The New Hampshire legislature will vote on over 1,000 bills this year, which is a lot to follow. Each week, this podcast highlights one bill that might not be getting news coverage, but still could impact you. I'm Anna Brown, Director of Research and Analysis for Citizens Count.
And I'm Mike Dunbar, Content Editor for Citizens Count. Anna, chances are you can't drive down any street in your neighborhood without being confronted with this issue. And I'm talking about litter. So New Hampshire is famously picturesque, but it seems many are intent on changing that given the number of discarded cans and fast food bags strewn along our roadsides. Now, some legislators in Concord think it's time to increase the penalties for littering, and they've actually introduced legislation to do just that.
That's right, HB 1461 and HB 1571.
It's like you knew I was going to ask that. All right, well...
It's like I knew what this podcast was about.
Why don't we start by laying out the law as it currently stands?
Okay, there are two different areas of New Hampshire law that forbid littering, RSA 265:102 and RSA 163-B. So most littering offenses are treated as a violation, like a speeding ticket, subject to a $62 fine. More serious littering involving hazardous materials or large quantities of trash could be a misdemeanor or run afoul of other environmental protection laws. If you throw litter out of a car, truck, or boat, you can get your license suspended for up to 7 days. And a judge can also order a person to clean up whatever they litter. Some towns also pass their own litter laws that have heavier fines or related rules.
All right. Okay, that makes sense. So you mentioned that legislators are considering two bills this year to increase the fine for littering?
Yes. So HB 1461 would fine litterers a minimum of $300 for a first offense and $500 for a second offense. And then any third or subsequent offense would cause the suspension of the person's driver's license for 90 days. And that part was a bit too much for some legislators, went a little too far on the House Transportation Committee. So they are recommending the full House amend the bill by dropping that 90-day suspension. So it would just raise the fines from $62 to $300 for that first offense and $500 for a second offense.
Gotcha.
The second bill, HB 1571, would increase the fine for littering by 20% and send that new revenue to the Fish and Game Department to support conservation officers. The House Criminal Justice and Public Safety Committee is recommending the full House kill this bill because the estimated one-time cost to implement the changes, about $75,000, would eclipse any new revenue from that 20% fine increase, which, according to the bill's fiscal note, would be less than $5,000 a year. The bigger fine increases in HB 1461 would more quickly cover those one-time costs to update state systems. So once again, if you're looking at those fiscal notes on the bills, they had some data on previous years, how many fines were brought in, what the revenue was like. So in 2020, the state issued 170 fines for littering and in 244 in 2019. So if each of those violations had carried a $300 fine instead of $62, the state would generate about $125,000 over the 2 years, which would be more than enough to cover any system update. So, you have to kind of do a little bit of fuzzy math because you don't know exactly how many people are going to litter and get fined for it. But definitely the larger increase would generate a lot more revenue than just a 20% increase.
Right. And maybe we should take a step back here as well and just think about generally the pros and cons of this whole situation. So obviously, increasing the fine for littering across the state would give sharper teeth to the state's litter laws, so that would be a good thing. Given the prevalence of rubbish along New Hampshire's roadways, some folks argue that small fines just aren't getting the job done. People aren't afraid of getting that $62 fine. And, maybe if that was increased, people would think twice about throwing the empty soda bottle or the cigarette butt out of the window.
It might also encourage officers to enforce litter laws more frequently because, I think a $62 fine, it's littering. Officers might not, think, let's not step in. Whereas $300, it's more money for the state. So, of course, then you get the flip side of the law enforcement argument because people will also say there's some challenges in the world right now about law enforcement and the public and misuse of force. And maybe we should not be encouraging law enforcement to be policing littering because obviously it's not, it's not murder or beating someone. It's ugly, it's bad for the planet, it's bad for the community. But stricter litter law maybe could lead to more hostile interactions between officers and the public. And so, okay, so what could you do instead? Maybe some sort of positive approach, like an education campaign, more public trash cans, more litter collection crews. I know even on Reddit, I've seen that they call it like a trash tag. It's a play on the word hashtag, obviously. And the idea is you take a picture of a place in your community that has a ton of litter, you clean it all up, you take the picture afterwards of all your bags of trash and how beautiful and pristine it is. So, there's other ways to address this besides big fine, big angry fine.
Right. Yeah. Another alternative I've seen would be just the bottle deposit law. So creating an incentive for people to return their bottles to designated receptacles instead of tossing them. HB 1652, another 2022 bill, would actually do just that. The state could also ban or limit distribution of some commonly littered items, such as plastic bags or straws. And yet another 2022 proposal, HB 1119, would allow towns to regulate the distribution of single-use plastic and paper bags to customers. Both of those bills have been subject of heated debate, as you can probably imagine.
Very heated debate.
But we'll save the pros and cons on those for another article. All right, Anna. So as we always do, we want to tell people, how can they make their voices heard on these bills?
The next step for HB 1461 and HB 1571 is a vote from the full House of Representatives, and the State House is next scheduled to meet February 16th, another voting day in Manchester, and they're also planning to continue to the next day if needed. So if you have an opinion on the state's litters laws, maybe you absolutely think that fine needs to go up to be a deterrent and stop people from littering, or maybe you think, no, that's not the right approach. I think that we should focus on other programs or ways to stop people. Reach out to the legislators who represent you and let them know where you stand. If you want to find who represents you, you can always go to citizenscount.org/elected-officials, or you can just click on our nav bar right on that elected officials, and you can select your town in our drop down. We try to make it as easy as possible.
Right. And I think we mentioned this in the last episode, but it's always helpful for legislators to hear about your personal experiences with an issue. So don't necessarily feel like you have to, cite all these statistics or be some kind of expert in litter. You are expert enough just having experienced it, or, whichever side of the issue you fall on is plenty of reason to make your voice heard. So don't be afraid to do that. With that, Anna, it's time for Only in New Hampshire. What you got for us this week?
So while researching this bill, I came across the DMV's list of driving offenses and corresponding fines. It's called the Uniform Fine Schedule. And as we mentioned earlier, the fine for littering is $62. I became very curious to compare that to fines for all sorts of other things. And there are definitely some offenses that I didn't even expect to see on there. So, for example, carrying passengers in a truck, I assume like in the bed of the truck,
right.
$62 fine. Failure to yield to an emergency vehicle, also $62. That one's interesting because I'm a little bit like, that seems kind of
seems
serious.
Worse to me. But okay.
Driving on the sidewalk, also $62. And then the one that really had me laugh, maybe I shouldn't laugh, but policy, it's always an interesting context. There's always a story. And so this one, you just read it at face value and you have to wonder, road racing, $62. So I can only assume that's because there are heftier fines for speeding, which that's like on a graduated. So like the more and more above the speed limit you are, the more and more money it is. And that can be hundreds of dollars.
What if you're not speeding though? What if you're road racing
very
at the speed limit?
Slow road racing? Well, $62, Mike. What else do you need to know? If you're on that tricycle in the road, it's $62. Although now that I think about it, there's probably, maybe you could be cited for not wearing proper like protective gear or something on your bike. I don't know. Excessive motorcycle noise related issue, $124. So very loud, nasty motorcycle right now. You're still paying more than someone littering. So, that's a value
or
judgment
driving
there.
On the sidewalk. I don't know.
Well, that's also another one too, where I just feel like you can picture it on so many different levels.
There's other offenses.
Like, it's probably most likely other things are going on at the same time, right? Like maybe that person is inebriated.
What if you're just really bad? What if you're just a terrible driver?
Well, then you also get and then you go like, I don't know, is there reckless endangerment or something that would come into play? But just on top of that, they can be like, also you drove on a sidewalk, $62.
Right.
Although to be fair,
please.
That is a little scary for me because we talked about me and my husband driving. He has pointed out to me, I clip corners all the time. Like it's bad. It's bad. So I probably shouldn't be saying that on this podcast because evidently, I mean, for all I know, I could get a $62 fine for that. He's just afraid I'm going to pop a tire one day. But
well, that's
I
probably,
just really don't want to veer on the other side.
That's probably, no, I'm thinking that's because of your inner road racer is coming out and you're just, what I was going to ask is which of us do you think would win in a road race if we were risking the $62 fine?
I mean, obviously me. You are way too polite. You are way too polite. You're the type of person where someone walks into you and you say, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Well, that about wraps up our episode for today, but you can find more information and episodes at citizensaccount.org. We'd like to thank Franklin Pierce University for producing and the Granite State News Collaborative for hosting. Our theme music is composed by me, Mike Dunbar. And lastly, we thank you for giving us a listen and thinking about how you can be part of what makes New Hampshire by the people, for the people.